Okay, so, all narrative consumption requires a choice. A book requires that you choose to turn to the next page, for example. And yeah, there are mediums that are consumed more passively, like film or music, but turning on a TV to play in the background while you make out with your date is a little bit different than watching a show and analyzing the way that the pieces fit together. It's a mental choice, rather than a physical choice, but it still requires mental effort. However, video games of all formats and genres are a choice-based medium. Those aren't guaranteed to be narratively significant choices, but you, as a writer, have the option to make them so. We care about our choices. Decision-making is a deeply personal, intimate process requiring effort to resolve, and the results of those choices matter to us greatly. There is an infamous theoretical experiment in philosophy known as the Trolley Problem, whose most typical case goes like this.
Imagine there's a runaway train hurtling down a train track. Directly ahead of the train, there are 5 people on the track. Now, imagine that you are too far away to help those 5 people. But right next to you, there's a lever that can divert the train onto another track. If you divert the train, the 5 people will be saved. But here's the catch. There's another person on the second track. Now, you're faced with a dilemma. You can either do nothing and the train will kill 5 people, or you can pull the lever and save their lives, but be directly responsible for 1 person's death. What would you do?
Let's switch up the scenario. A trolley is barreling down the tracks where it will hit and kill 5 distracted fools who think hanging out on an active rail line is a good time. You are standing on a footbridge above the railway line, next to an overweight stranger, and you're certain that if they were standing on the tracks, the trolley would be stopped, and the 5 other people would be saved. You could push the stranger. Only 1 person dies instead of 5, but they die because of you. If you've been paying attention at all this past semester, these should be pretty recognizable instances of narratives. There are narrative agents, a setting, time is progressing from past to present, but there's an important distinction that separates these hypotheticals from a book or creative nonfiction. You have a choice, and your choice determines how the narrative ends. It's an interactive narrative, just like a story-driven video game. There's been all sorts of philosophical discussion on these and other variants to the trolley problem, but let's focus on the psychological studies. Surveys have repeatedly found that roughly 90% of people would be willing to flip the switch, but the majority of those same people would not push the overweight person off the bridge. Studies that scanned people's brains while they were questioned about the trolley problem found that the switch scenario provoked more activity in parts of the brain associated with logical processing, and the footbridge variant activated parts of the brain associated with emotional reasoning, despite the result being, from a utilitarian perspective, identical. When actually placed into a situation where they believed their choices would have real consequences on the lives of real people, the majority of people wouldn't even flip a switch.
Suppose we conducted an experiment in a realistic railroad switching station, with test subjects watching trains on monitors. The trains, and the people on the tracks, would be staged and pre-recorded, but the subjects would think it was all real. They would believe that they could control a lever that switches the tracks, and they'd have the option to divert the train or not. They'd be totally convinced that they have to choose between 5 lives or 1. The train probably had sensors. The workers would have noticed. I didn't want to touch the equipment. These are all forms of attribution, when an individual assumes that others are either responsible for taking action or have already done so. At this point, 1 subject had switched the tracks and 5 others had not.
Everyone had some explanation for their behavior.
Yes.
Each one was different.
Yes, each person told themselves a story about what was happening.
What's the point of all of this? What does it have to do with narrative, with video games? All of this is meant to demonstrate that readers care about their choices. They're emotionally invested in what they decide to do, and they increasingly care about choices that are immersive and intimate. They'd be willing to flip a hypothetical switch, but they wouldn't be willing to push a hypothetical stranger. As writers, I think we frequently struggle to find ways to emotionally engage our readers, to reach past the bounds of fiction and prose, and to have the reader consider our work genuinely, with conscious, deliberate thought. You can do that by giving them a choice. Make the reader a character. Let them shape what happens. They will care that much more about how the story ends. Although, interactive fiction is not the perfect medium for every story. We've had text-based adventures for well over 3 decades, but it's hardly as if readers stopped buying books or watching movies. Giving the reader too much choice can create an unpleasant experience, sometimes illustrated very well by this experiment on choice overload.
Most people say they like a lot of choices, but do they really? We took our cameras and a few pounds of jelly beans to Venice Beach to find out. First, we invited people to pick one of 2 flavor choices.
How is it?
Yeah, good.
Tell me if you're happy with your choice.
Yeah, I'm happy with it. Thank you.
Most subjects were content with their selection when it was a choice between 2 options. But what happens when we offer more choices? Will the subjects be just as happy with their decision?
I see. Not licorice. Okay, can I do more than one? Or just one? Oh my goodness. Well, I'm kind of regretting not trying a fruit one, because with jelly beans, fruit is more natural to me. Like, I probably should have gone for my first choice, a raspberry. Maybe I would have been happy.
The main thing I want you to take away from this is that interactive narratives are one of many powerful options available to you as a storyteller and as a narratologist. Don't use interactivity for every idea that comes into your head, but don't discount the medium of video games as a pastime, a leisure activity, a hobby. When considering how to communicate your narrative, try placing it within the framework of interactivity and see if it works. We care about our choices. By giving them a choice, you can make your reader care about your narrative.